Yeah, it was fun. His sister was in first grade, so he wanted a picture of the first grade names. We saw a lot of it, not everything. Yeah, a lot of it.
Well, Monica has, we got state public historic teacher.
Yes, that was wonderful. I was there when she showed me.
She had the book.
She gave me some. Yes. He's so excited. It was such a special moment. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. How are you? Great to see you. Thanks for coming. Are we ready to go ahead and get started, everyone? Okay, cool. So thanks for coming up. I hope that you've been having a great day, whether you've been in parent-teacher conferences or touring the school. I hope that it's been a good day so far. We've got a really special presentation for you today on the art of Frank Wesley. He was a former Woodstock art teacher. You'll be hearing more about him from Mr. Eicher, as well as his son, Dr. Michael Wesley, who's joining us today. So without further ado, I will ask our principal, Dr. Craig Cook, to give an introduction to our two speakers.
Thank you, Jamie. Great to see you all here. Thank you, students, for being here. This is a great occasion and some of the best of what Woodstock has to offer, where we bring history together, our identities, around a common theme, which is very interesting in this case, which is art and faith and how they engage. So we're looking forward to hearing from one of our own esteemed colleagues, Mr. Stefan Eicher. But first, let me introduce our very special guest from the University of Melbourne, Dr. Michael Wesley. Dr. Wesley is the Deputy Vice Chancellor International at the University of Melbourne, and he's responsible for leading all the university's international engagements. Professor Wesley has extensive experience in international strategy. Our students, some of them, were just privileged to hear a talk on the Quad, among other things, just about an hour ago. He's worked in higher education, in government, in the private sector, and his research particularly focuses on Australian foreign policy, Asia's international relations and strategic affairs, and the politics of state-building interventions. And his most recent book is called Restless Continent: Wealth, Rivalry, and Asia's New Geopolitics. So, Dr. Wesley, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on campus. And then without further ado, again, our esteemed colleague, Mr. Stefan Eicher. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Stefan to us. He's been teaching art at Woodstock for these last 3 years. He, of course, is an alum of Woodstock, and he has a Master in Fine Arts and Visual Arts and an MBA in International Development. And prior to Woodstock, he helped found and run for 12 years the local New Delhi-based arts organization called Arts for Change, with the goal of seeing art shape society with beauty and truth. Stefan took a personal interest in Frank Wesley as an artist after discovering him later in life, and wrote a chapter exploring the life and art of Frank Wesley, Michael's father, for a book that he published in 2014 on the topic of art and Christian faith. So Stefan, it's a pleasure to have you address us. Thank you so much. Come forward.
Thank you, Professor Wesley, for giving me the chance to speak about your father. I feel completely inadequate, but I have done some reading from my own personal interest in your father, and as I will share, it really is an honor to talk about him, because I feel we need to be talking more about Frank Wesley for several reasons, and I hope this sharing of the little that I've come across and come to learn will help support that statement. So let me start with just to give you sort of a taste here of, or rather, just the overview, and I hope we can get through these. Really, it's an introduction to Frank Wesley, and that's our overall goal. Hoping that biographical facts help put his art into context, looking specifically at some of his styles and techniques. We have a lot of art students here today, which is really exciting. And you've been working on some similar techniques, but we'll get a little bit into that. And then really exploring him as a person, his personal integrity and religious expression through his art. And at the end, I would be so grateful if Professor Wesley, you could give a response, and we'll open it up for questions and answers. So to begin with, Frank Wesley, there's some interesting tidbits of information I'm going to start with. One is that he painted this image that was used for the first UNICEF Christmas card. And there was an initiative of UNICEF to raise money for the work they do amongst children. A second interesting piece of information is that he designed the urn that carried Gandhiji's ashes for immersion in Allahabad after his assassination. And in fact, Frank Wesley was given the honor of being in the actual boat when they were poured into the river. And this piece, which is considered one of his masterpieces, some time back was the band U2, right? Bono, U2, requested its use for one of their campaigns. Particularly, it is an HIV/AIDS campaign, but they reached out. There's a sense that his art reached far, right? And yet at the same time, there's something very special about Frank Wesley as a man. And he worked at the school. He was a part of the community here from these years. He started teaching first through 12th grade, and was then allowed to just focus on high school, which made it a bit easier for him. But Frank Wesley was a prolific artist, and he loved the outdoors, and he would go, at least this is from what I've read about him. And so again, please correct me if I've gotten any of these facts wrong, but he spent a lot of time walking the hills and would constantly be creating. So much so that there was the annual Mayfair, which was what back then, and it became, I think, June sale, and I'm not sure what we're calling it now, but there's the annual kind of event. He set up a table and would sell these works that he made, and it became very popular, and even after he left Woodstock, that continued on for another 10 years. But the stories are of people would visit him. Of course, in those days, telephones didn't exist, so if you had to communicate something, you had to go to their house, and they would literally purchase art off of the easel, and because of just the beauty of what he was producing. Small anecdote, when we had a reunion, an alum reunion, when WONWOSA ran a reunion last year, it was a virtual reunion, some of the alum artists presented their work, and Mr. Steve Alter, who's a writer, his entire presentation was about how Frank Wesley, as a visual artist, influenced him as a writer. And there'll be a little bit of an insight into that in a bit. But the response from the participants was remarkable. And these were an older generation of alums. But there were people, after the talk was over, the participants gave their responses, and one after the other had memories of Frank Wesley. And one of them, they're in the 60s, 70s years of age, and one of them was emotional. She was speaking about Frank Wesley, saying, I still think about him and how he invested in me, and what I still remember things that he told me. So this is one aspect about Frank Wesley I wanted to bring up. There's another, and I hope I'm not going to take really long with this, but I think it's an important anecdote. I was a student at Woodstock, and back in class of 90, 4 years here, and a lot of the time I spent in and out of LCH. Right? As you enter LCH, there's a foyer and there's a big wall on the right, and many of you will be aware of that space. But when I was here, and back in the 90s, there was a big painting on that wall. And I always noticed it because of the size. But I didn't really understand it because it was very brown due to the ravages of time, and it had been lacquered, and that lacquer had turned brown. But it was obviously a very old painting. I didn't know who made it. And when I returned to Missouri as an adult, it had disappeared, and I didn't notice. In 2010, I read in the alum newsletter of the discovery of a Frank Wesley masterpiece. And it had been discovered in the attic of LCH. And then the school took it and in partnership with Intac, Delhi, restored it. And that painting, called Jesus Healing the Sick, is the one that you guys see every day in the library if you were to look up. Okay? But the reason I bring this up is that discovery in many ways was kind of my experience, and I suspect the experience of many of others in my generation and your all generation, you younger folks, underlining the need, I feel, for us to talk about Frank Wesley. Why? Okay, I'll just list out really briefly the connections to our history. He is part of our heritage, and to us as a Woodstock community. As art students, he was his model. He spent, after studying, after college, he spent an additional 18 years pursuing education. He was an IB learner. He was a lifelong learner. His fascinating expression of religious and personal faith through his art, which is something we're wanting to look at, which both inspires Christians who come from countries that are non-Western. And we'll look at that a little bit, but also enriches us as a community in general. And finally, because of his example and his personal model of integrity. So, the facts, and as you art students know, the facts help you put the artist's work in context, right? That's one of the basic IB ideas, is you need to know the context at the point of creation. Frank Wesley grew up in a very small part of UP called Azamgarh. It's now, of course, that's the district, but and it's now a bigger town. But back then it was a village. His mother was a doctor in a small Australian mission hospital, and that's where she met his father, who was in charge of the boys' hostel. They were fifth generation. They were the fifth generation of a Christian family, so they had their roots both in Hindu and Muslim families. But what was fascinating about Frank Wesley as a child was that he spent a lot of time in the village. His house literally opened up into the village, and he was just naturally curious. And so we see that as he's making these paintings, he's constantly drawing on those experiences of his childhood, the objects, the scenery, the experiences, and very much the exposure he had to being from a Christian family to friends and neighbors of various other faiths. these are giving you also a little bit of a sense of the variety of styles that Frank Wesley utilized, and we'll get to that point in a little bit. But one very important event in his life to help understand the artist. And that was that while as a child, Frank Wesley went through typhoid fever and lost much of his hearing. And this is a very important and interesting fact because, I've read about this, and I'll take the liberty to read out from Nancy Ray, who spent a lot of time with Frank Wesley and wrote a book about him. But she puts it this way: he was a very friendly man, very energetic, witty, well-liked, very empathetic. But this is what she says: the quietness of his inner world, once he experienced deafness, seemed to have led to a sense of self-control and gentleness, and the spiritual seeking of his soul, which found its own way without relying much on outside stimulation. There's a sense that there was this inner, Frank Wesley had, as a result of this experience, an inner strength and an integrity, a peacefulness, yet a person of strength and confidence. And it's something that I thought I'll point out at the beginning, and I'm going to remind you at the end, because it has to do with one of our guiding principles of wholeness, of integrity, of this sense of having an undivided nature, right? Our internal life, we hide it. We put on these facades, right? It's understandable. We're at every age, and yet the wholeness is being inside the same person that you're outside. And this is something very striking about Frank Wesley, and had a profound impact on the art that he made. All right. Style, technique. Frank Wesley was known for something called the Lucknow Watercolor School. And this is a process of taking a sheet of paper, and as many of us have been practicing in our art class, working wet on wet, making it wet to start with, placing paint on it, but once it dries, putting it back and actually submerging it underwater, bringing it out, letting it dry, painting on it, and again submerging it underwater, an exhaustive process. But the result of it is these glowing colors, these extremely soft textures, and kind of a luminosity that this particular style that Frank Wesley worked in was famous for. Another interesting aspect of his style is something that you will notice in these images in terms of the eyes and what's called a very calligraphic line, a very gently flowing, gracefully flowing line. And now this is no accident, and this is kind of where we're starting to understand Frank Wesley's religious art. These are not Frank Wesley's paintings. These are paintings found in Ajanta, the caves, right? And what happened in Indian history is that there was a school of art that reacted to basically the British telling Indian artists paint this way, which was British Raj Company style, where they commissioned Indian artists to paint the way they wanted, very European, very representational, or other styles where we have Ravi Varma trying a more of an Indian representation and yet using mostly European convention. Abindranath Tagore was the nephew of Rabindranath Tagore, thank you, and he launched this, what was called the Bengal Renaissance in terms of the art, or the Bengal Art School. His student, Bireshwar Sen, was sent to Lucknow as a principal of an art school, which is the art school that Frank Wesley joined. And here's the thing, Frank Wesley and Bireshwar Sen established a very strong relationship. and it was a Guru Chela or Guru Shishya form of education that profoundly affected his understanding of education itself. In fact, it's one of the reasons why he actually ended up leaving Woodstock, because he was frustrated with, he couldn't fit in with this Western system of education. And I think, from what I understand, he tried to bring in an Indianness, more of this Guru Shishya style, but it failed. There were other reasons as well for his eventually leaving. We'll get to that. But this cannot be underestimated, the profound relationship he had with Bireshwar Singh. Now, going back to the images that you saw, what is this image about, actually? Any ideas? Birthing? Childbirth, wonderful. Anything more specific? You gave it away. Jesus. This is a nativity scene. All right? This is, and Frank Wesley called it nativity with women attending. Right? So he's taking a biblical event and he's connecting it to his own experiences of the village. He's seeing it through the eyes of his knowledge and experience of the village. Does this sound familiar? It's a continuation of that the Christmas story, right? Mary and Joseph, they can't find a place in an inn, and they end up in a stable. And the village kids come to take a look at who appeared. So there's different styles that Frank Wesley is using, but it's interesting that he's starting to present stories that he's read in the Bible, and with the idiom, with the language, with the experience that he's had in terms of rural India. This is an interesting image because one of the ways that Frank Wesley ended up finding a kind of financial support for what he was doing and encouragement along these lines was a magazine that was started for Christians in the villages, and they approached Frank Wesley and asked, could you make paintings of biblical stories and that we want to include in this magazine? And so every month he would make another painting for the magazine, and what would happen, and they were printed in color. And so these local families would take the paintings out and put them and frame them. And for these Christian communities in rural India at the time, it was the equivalent of their neighbors, the Hindu neighbors, putting up the calendars of the Raja Ravi Varma calendars of gods and goddesses. And so it helped them kind of give an expression of their faith, just as their neighbors were. He also ended up working in miniature, and this is something, I don't know, can anybody see the angel? So it's the biblical story of when the angel comes to Mary and tells her, you are going to give birth to the Savior of the world. Yeah? Should I give it away?
Her head is on the ground.
Yeah, there she is. Right? And she's touching Mary's feet. It's a very, very deeply Indian understanding of respect, giving respect to this teenage girl who's going to play this outsized role. Right? Nativity, there's another nativity. And to Frank Wesley, this cow was a mother cow, shielding Mary. He talked about Mother India, a symbol of Mother India. Behind it is there's a halo and a tree that is symbolic of death. So kind of a foreshadowing of the birth of Christ and the death of Christ. It's a cypress tree. Flight to Egypt. Right? This is inspired by Rajput miniatures of Lord Shiva and Parvati that were very common at the time. And even the handing of this bowl of milk is based on Shiva handing a bowl of milk to the snake that is wrapped around Lord Shiva's neck. And so you're starting to see that with his exposure, he's looking for, of course, he's being asked to make imagery that expresses stories from the Bible, but it's going somewhere deeper. He spent some time in Japan. That 18 years, there was 4 of those years was in Japan studying Japanese art, and you can see the effect of some of us who've done our research paper on hokusai will recognize these sharp angles. And he was a learner, like I said, and constantly drawing things in. Now let's go back there and notice the color of the Christ child, right? There again, as a young boy, right? He's basing his understanding he's expressing his understanding of the divinity of Christ in this idiom. Of course, Krishna is always shown as a child in the color blue. The interesting thing is, it's both symbol, and some of us have studied Mr. Franz Marc and Expressionism, and for Franz Marc, blue was, anybody remember? These all represented different things. Yellow, anyone? Femininity, blue was masculinity. For some of the expressionists, blue was a spiritual color. They actually had a connection they were influenced by Eastern thinking. So color can be used symbolically in European religious art. Christ is wearing red and blue. El Greco repeats the same thing. Blue is is a color, is symbolic for truth. Red for sacrifice, right? And so forth. But what's fascinating about these is it's not just symbolism, right? He's drawing on deeper roots here. Symbolism, this is just packed with symbolism. He brings in something abstract here, so he's melding together different influences into a Rajput miniature, right? And these birds symbolize the peacock, the glory of God, asceticism. There's a water bird, which is symbolic for continual happiness or happiness in all circumstances. Holiness up there. Typical of Rajput miniatures, banana on the right, mango on the left, blessing and abundance, and so forth. Just on the side, he was a student of wildlife and made that beautiful miniature there. But one thing another just aspect in addition to this, he was very much expressive symbolism, and but for him the symbol, if somebody asked him, what does that mean? He would tell them, I painted it, you're the one who's supposed to figure it out. And it was only towards the end of his life that he started to share more about what these meanings were, because he had a sense that his time was coming to an end. Another interesting aspect here is in terms of symbolry that draws on something deeper in terms of his Indian identity, is these Christ's forehead is gold, and that's this symbolic of knowledge, of divine knowledge. Again, Christ's forehead is gold, and you can't quite see it in this reproduction, but also drawing on Buddhist iconography, the long earlobes. Do you know why Buddha's earlobes are shown as long? Because he came from a wealthy background, right? He wore earrings, heavy earrings, right? And that was a physical sign of wealth. And so this image of Christ speaking to, and this is a biblical account to another a wealthy man, but Frank Wesley presents him using the language of that is familiar in terms of wealth and honor. This he saw as an elongated third eye, this sense that the all-seeing eye of God, etc. We can go with each of these. We can keep going deeper, but I need to run through this a little bit faster. But Christ the Lord, right? There's something very obviously non-European about him, or about the placement of where Jesus is. And that was a reaction to these images. So this is a very famous, I believe in the 50s, this came out, right? A blue-eyed European Jesus, a white man. This came a little bit later, very famous, I think, in the 80s. But what was Jesus looking? What was his ethnicity? Was it blonde? I mean, literally blonde and blue-eyed, or was it something more akin to this? This is the BBC did a kind of a reproduction of what Christ could have looked like, and came up with this. Very non-European. In fact, very closely linked to even Asia. Of course, he was a Palestinian Jew, but very Asian in his features. And that brings us to the masterpiece here. And some of the symbolism here this is the story of the prodigal son who takes his father's wealth, and before he's died, he takes his inheritance and spends it, and ends up hitting the dirt bottom, and comes back to his father. And what's beautiful about this is the fact that the way Frank Wesley composed it is your conclusion is the father had to run towards the son to stop him from falling over, from falling forward. And that's a very key aspect of the biblical account, that the father runs to the son rather than waiting for the son to come to him. And there's some very interesting things about color that he's used up here. There's a separation of color, and yet as you keep going down, they mix and they become one color here. Even the bodies, the two bodies up here are separate, and yet as you come down, they kind of merge into each other. Again, we could, just a point about this was that it was commissioned by LCH, so I'm super curious because I would think it still belongs to LCH. So I don't want to say this publicly, but it'd be interesting. There must be a story behind it. But I read about it that they had commissioned Frank Wesley specifically to make this painting for that wall in LCH. And this is the other painting that we have here. And just to give, again, a little bit of the context, Frank Wesley, besides going to Japan, he studied in the States. He did an MFA. And at the time when abstract expressionism was big, right? Abstract expressionists in this group here. And so you see this, again, it's a very different feel to everything else he's been doing. But look at this. This is another one he made around that time. It's the light is a bit dim, but Cain and Abel, the biblical story of Cain killing Abel. And but very, very, in a sense, expressionist. There's an abstraction to it, but it's also very expressionist. There's another story from the Bible of Christ healing the two demon-possessed men. Very expressionists and completely different. So he's drawing on these influences, but the key is he's making them his own, right? Because at the heart of it, and this is kind of where I wanted to bring this to kind of a conclusion, is that, by the way, very, very, very creative compositions. This is Christ calls Peter to have faith and walk on water, because Peter and the other disciples are in a boat. And you can see the creative storytelling here. It's not just illustration, right? These disciples, they form the shape of a boat. And if you can see it, there are actually footsteps. Do you see that footstep here? Kind of like almost like a graphic element, like superimposed on top. And then there's this aspect here, and it's Peter kind of falling below the waves, and he cries out for help. So very a progression and an integration of many styles, and at the end of the day, a personal expression. One of the last wow, I've gone over time. I'm sorry. But this, I'll just bring it to a close here. But this a visual expression of his reflection on the idea of the Holy Spirit, right? There's no, interestingly, you can't tell whether it's a man or a woman, right? And there's some very interesting things happening in these four corners, but the blue, right? The blue of the color of truth is emerging or pointing to the mouth. Using the Ajanta, again, the Bengal school visual idiom here of how to present eyes. So in closing, just to say that one of the reasons why for me, Frank Wesley is a discovery, as he is for, I think, many people in my generation, is that he never became quote-unquote famous. Now, part of that was because his primary patronage was the missionary community, who were commissioning him to make these paintings for the magazine. And another reason is, however, is because on purpose he chose not to become famous. And there were many galleries over the course of his life that wanted to represent him, wanted to run major exhibitions, and he chose not to. He found that his friends and colleagues that he had studied with were pursuing that fame and with it, a certain amount of wealth. But it was a specific choice, and instead, what we see happening is that wherever he is, he finds himself amongst a community of fans, so to speak, who love his work, who buy his work as soon as it's off the easel sometimes, even when it's still on there, they're asking for it. And that was where he found his satisfaction. And it goes back to, I think, and even the courage to express his religious faith in these ways that are in some expressing in universal truths as well as very specific beliefs that he had from the Bible. But just to go back to the statement of Nancy Ray, that he didn't need to explain himself, he found his spiritual seeking of his soul found its own way without relying much on outside stimulation. Right? He had an integrity that goes back to one of our core guiding principles, which is wholeness, which is saying that inner part of me needs to be the same as the outer part of me. It's the hardest thing in the world. At your guys' age and even at when you get older. But that's what wholeness is this integration of the inner me is the same as the outer me. I'm not putting on a show. And that was something that personally I really respect and appreciate about what I've found out about Frank Wesley, your father. Thank you.
Well, Stefan, I'm incredibly humbled and really quite overcome. Dad would have loved that presentation. I'm not sure I can say very much because I've learnt a lot in your presentation, and I'm certainly hoping I can get access to the video link because I'd love to share it with my family. And okay, what can I say? A couple of things. You've covered just about everything. One was just to go back to, I guess, what I was saying to the students not very long ago, and it was something that I really learnt from Dad. So you went back to the history and how he went to study in Lucknow with Bariswa Sen. The other thing about Lucknow is that it was part of a Shiite kingdom, and so that art school also had a deep tradition of Persian-inspired art. And so one of the things that Dad has is a collection of Boris Voisin's miniatures. You know, dozens and dozens of these miniatures. And of course, he painted literally hundreds of miniatures through his life. And so when he finished his, I think he did 2 degrees at Lucknow, he won a scholarship. It was a scholarship from a very wealthy American art patron who had become aware of his work. And the scholarship basically said, you can go anywhere in the world and study anything. And so this was the early 1950s, and he went to Boris Voisin and he said, I've been offered this scholarship and I'm thinking of going to Iran, and because I've been trained in the Persian style, to deepen my training in the Persian style. And Boris Voisin said to him, no, you should go to the art tradition that is most different from the one you have learnt. And that's why he went to Japan. So he went to Japan in the early 1950s. He was deaf. He couldn't speak any Japanese. He learnt to speak Japanese, and he lived and worked there for 5 years. And part of his catalogue is some beautiful Japanese-inspired calligraphy, but also very spare Japanese painting. And he fell in love with Japan, but then when he'd finished in Japan, he came back to India briefly and was studying again, and I'm not sure if it was the same patron or a different one, said, once again, you can go anywhere in the world and study whatever you like. And I think Sen was dead by then, but he took that lesson, and so he went to Chicago because he had no experience or feel for modern art, and so that's what you brought out. So I think Dad was always looking for difference. He was looking to learn from what was the most different thing. And as I was saying to the students earlier, that is the most profoundly educative thing you can do, is to take yourself well outside of your comfort zone and just study from a completely different point of view. And so hearing you talk about his art and how the different styles came out and merged was really profoundly moving. There is another phase, of course, of his journey, which was Australia. And again, how much more profoundly different from his experience than to go to a country like Australia, which, had its own incredible landscape, and some of his most beautiful pieces of religious art draw on the Australian landscape as well. So that's one point I would make, but the other point I would make is I think Dad's religion was profoundly political, and his art was profoundly political. So you started with the urn for Gandhi. So his family was intensely involved in the independence movement. His father, despite running a Methodist boys' hostel, back in the 1920s, stopped wearing Western clothing, would only wear Indian clothing. And I think he picked that up. It became an important part of him. When he went to the United States, he became quite heavily involved in the civil rights movement. He designed a lot of the artwork for the civil rights movement. And so I think in the same way, his determination to depict Christian scenes, Christian stories in a non-Western way was actually an intensely political act. And the established church, be it here in India, often in places like the US, in Australia, they didn't like that. They wanted the blonde, blue-eyed Jesus. They thought that depicting the Christ child as a blue figure was importing paganism into Christianity. So he faced a lot of backlash, and he was, I think, very courageous about that. He never took a backward step, continued to paint as he wanted to paint. And the last thing I would say is part of his politics was the intense identification with the marginalised, which comes across in all of the paintings. So I've said enough. I really want to thank you. I really want to thank Woodstock School. This has been an extraordinary experience. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Stefan, first for that such a thoughtful presentation of Frank's life's work, and it serves as inspiration to us all. And Dr. Wesley, thank you for allowing Woodstock into your richly personal space. We all can identify with that, and when I think about your father's life and what we can learn from it, this going outside of ourselves, extending ourselves well beyond our normal boundaries. But your father had the ability to bring it home in a meaningful way. It didn't stay out there. It came home and made meaning and significance to people's lives. And so I think that's certainly my takeaway, and I'm sure you all have your own takeaways from this intense time. But thank you for letting us in on your personal journey with your father. Really appreciate it. And thank you to all of you, staff and students, for taking the time to be here for these moments. These are priceless, and we know that we'll carry some of these lessons with you in your own way for the rest of your life. So thank you. Thank you to those of us joining us on the live stream as well. All right. I think with that, we're dismissed, and we'll have some tea out in the backside of the CFI building. Thank you so much.